Welcome to the Inside Scoop. This is Mark Levine. We've got a terrific show for you tonight. The next 2 hours, we're going to talk about drugs, and specifically drug policy in the United States, the legalization of marijuana. There was a convention on the Americans for Safe Access right here in Washington, D.C. And the question is, well, is our drug policy a good one or not? Many of us understand that drugs are dangerous, but perhaps our policy against drugs is more dangerous. Anyway, we've got quite a lineup for you tonight on this topic, and of course, want to encourage you to call in at 202-889-9797 if you want to add your 2 cents. But first, we've got Chris Hermes. He's the media liaison for Americans for Safe Access. He's been working to help people have access to medical marijuana. Then we're going to have a pre-recorded interview I did with Dr. Kevin Sabet. He has been called the quarterback of anti-drug policy. He actually worked for 3 presidents, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, on preventing drug legalization. So you want to hear from the other side. Then we've got Jeremy Hall, the Federal Advocacy Council for the Sentencing Project, talking about ways that the juvenile justice system and the federal prison system, basically how we punish people who use drugs and whether there needs to be reform there. Then coming up, we got Norm Stamper. He's a retired chief of police in Seattle. He's going to give us a cop's eye view on the ground, someone who goes out and arrests people for drug crimes, talking about what he has seen and what should be done. And then finally, we've got Spike Bradford, senior research associate for the Justice Policy Institute, who's going to talk about the criminal justice system and really a lot of statistical work on what we have done, what we do in the criminal justice system to prosecute people with drugs. So we got a whole host of people, various views. I want to deal with all aspects of this topic, and I'm really, really excited about all the guests I have. Let me start with Chris Hermes. As I said, he's a media liaison for Americans for Safe Access, which is the largest national member-based organization of patients, medical professionals, scientists, and concerned citizens promoting safe and legal access to cannabis for therapeutic use and research. Mr. Chris Hermes, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
All right. So, Chris, I actually did the pre-recorded interview with Dr. Sabet, so I know a lot of what he's going to say. We're going to hear from him after you. But let me first talk about Americans for Safe Access. You are arguing for access for medical use. Does that mean that you don't advocate for recreational use?
That's correct.
Tell me exactly what your organization does.
Well, we were founded in 2002 to push back against a very aggressive enforcement actions by the Bush administration, namely raiding medical marijuana collectives in California. That eventually grew into the grassroots organization that we are today, working to educate not just patients and doctors, but lawyers and policymakers and the general public, and lobbying and also litigating impact cases that will have a sweeping effect on patients and their rights across the country.
Okay, so let's be very frank here. What are the medical uses of marijuana?
Oh, they are vast. Probably the biggest reason people use medical marijuana, therapeutically, is for chronic pain. More than 100 million Americans suffer from chronic pain, and most of those people take very toxic pharmaceutical medication to deal with that pain. And what we found is that medical marijuana has the ability to reduce or eliminate that pharmaceutical load. But people take it for all sorts of other reasons.
Well, let's deal with it before we get to that. Let's talk about chronic pain, because obviously, Mr. Hermes, we got we have Tylenol, we have very severe things like codeine, we've got all kinds of painkillers out there. Some addictive, maybe oxycodone comes to mind, but we certainly have a whole bunch of drugs that you can take for pain. How is marijuana different from all of those?
Well, it's different in its side effects, and whereas if you're taking opiates or heavy narcotics to deal with your pain, you're in many cases like a walking zombie, and also it can be cheaper than taking a lot of pharmaceutical medication. So you've got affordability and you've got a lower level of side effects, and for people, side effects mean a lot in terms of quality of life. So if you can take a couple of hits off of a marijuana cigarette versus, taking OxyContin, for example, that's beneficial to many people. And it's not a matter of either or. It's a matter of giving people as many therapeutic options as possible so that they can choose which one works best for
Okay.
them.
Now, I interrupted you. Go on. You were talking about other uses other than pain killing, medical uses for marijuana.
Well, as you might know, marijuana can often act as an appetite stimulant, and for people who are finding it difficult to keep food down, that can be very important. Or it can also suppress nausea for people who are dealing with chemotherapy as a result of cancer. There is an aging population in the United States that uses medical marijuana for things like arthritis. But other conditions, such as the tremors and pain experienced from multiple sclerosis, medical marijuana has been very good at alleviating those symptoms.
AIDS patients have found uses for it. What are the uses for someone with AIDS?
Well, a lot of people living with HIV suffer from neuropathic pain. It apparently works very well on neuropathic pain. But also the side effects from ARVs and other drugs that people living with HIV have to take.
And I understand that people with glaucoma also can use medical marijuana. How does that work?
Glaucoma is a fairly well-known condition that people use marijuana for. However, it's not as prevalent as other conditions. As I understand it, and I'm not a scientist, it relieves the ocular pressure and makes it more bearable.
Okay, when I interviewed, and we're going to hear the interview in just about a half an hour, but I interviewed Dr. Sabet, and I asked him about the medical uses of marijuana. He responded by saying that he's okay with the medical uses of marijuana, but you don't need to, as you put it, take a couple hits off a marijuana cigarette, that you could separate the THC and the chemical qualities of marijuana that do these good things that he admits they do, which I've actually found very interesting, that he conceded the medical benefits of marijuana right off the top, sort of surprised me. But he said that you could get the benefits in terms of pain killing and the other things you mentioned, Chris, that you can do it by separating the chemical from the drug. You didn't have to smoke it. You could take a pill or something that has THC and have the same effects. How do you respond to that?
Well, there is a pill on the market. It's called Marinol, and it's 100% THC, synthetic, mind you, in a pill. The problem is that it doesn't work for everyone, and there are more than 70 cannabinoids or chemical components in the plant that have the potential for therapeutic use in the body. And so a Marinol pill, which just has one of those components, is not necessarily going to work for everyone. It's also expensive, and it requires FDA approval going through the new drug application process. And if Marinol is the only pill that's being offered, patients need other options than that. And one of the important things about smoked marijuana in particular, as opposed to other methods of intake, like ingesting it, absorbing it through the digestive system, but smoking allows the body to intake the medication quickly. If you take a couple of hits off of a cigarette, as I mentioned, the effects are almost immediate. Whereas if you take a pill, you have to wait for it to go through the digestive system. It takes 45 or 60 minutes, and you don't always know the dose that you're getting, and you don't have an accurate way of titrating that dose where, again, taking a toke off of a cigarette will enable you to better titrate the dose that you need to alleviate the pain or whatever condition you're dealing with.
Is there a way to separate, this is something that drug control advocates seem to care a lot about, is there a way to separate the psychoactive effects, the effects of getting high, from the medical effects that you're talking about, pain killing and relieving ocular pressure and so forth? Is there a way to do that in a joint to separate those two effects, or are they not separable?
Well, no, they are, and it's a fascinating new area of study. There are literally thousands of different strains of marijuana because of all of the different cannabinoids you can breed them in different proportions to each other. And in fact, one of the other main cannabinoids besides THC, which is the most well-known and psychoactive ingredient, is cannabidiol, CBD, and that is known to be a pain reliever. And so growers are breeding high CBD strains and low THC strains, and that has shown to diminish the psychoactive effect and increase the pain relief effect.
So it sounds like there's some room for compromise between you and the Office of National Drug Control Policy, that perhaps if we develop a marijuana cigarette that has high CBD and low THC, there might be some room for compromise. Is there room for compromise here?
Well, I think there should be room for compromise. I think the government and folks like Kevin Sabet are finding ways to push back against any version of a smoked medication or vaporized, for that matter. I haven't talked about vaporization, but it's a heating process that heats the marijuana below combustion temperatures, but allows the constituents of the plant to be released so they can be inhaled by the user, but it's much less damaging, even though smoking is not very damaging according to plenty of studies out there. It's been shown that smoking marijuana does not increase your likelihood of getting lung cancer or any other type of cancer.
Really?
Maybe some...
I'm surprised by that, because obviously tobacco kills 400,000 people a year, and I recognize that people smoke a lot more tobacco. The average, tobacco addict, people hooked on cigarettes, might smoke a pack or two a day, whereas even someone who smokes marijuana once a day might have one joint. But I would still think that the smoke itself would cause lung cancer. Again, not to the levels of tobacco. No, it doesn't?
Not true, and actually there's little to no risk of lung cancer smoking marijuana, and those studies have come out of UCLA. Dr. Donald Tashkin is a preeminent cannabis researcher who is also a pulmonary researcher and has done extensive studying on this. And tobacco is a different plant. Companies that produce cigarettes put in all sorts of additives that contribute to the cancer-causing effects of tobacco smoking.
Chris, one of the issues that people have with medical marijuana is they say it's a farce. That yes, there are real people, of course, with cancer and AIDS and glaucoma who need the drug, but there are a small percentage of marijuana users, and that if you go to California, where there's a medical marijuana law, that 90% of the people will say, I have a headache, or in other words, that they're recreational users masquerading as medical marijuana users, and that it's just a fig leaf. How do you respond to that?
Well, I invite folks who believe that to talk to any number of patients, that are using it and have had a almost miraculous effect on their lives. There are numerous, perhaps endless stories that you can listen to, at least anecdotally.
But Chris, I think what I'm saying is that no one's disputing those real life stories of people, again, with these real conditions who have suffered. What they're saying is that is true for, let's say, 10% of users. But for 90% of users, they aren't suffering from these chronic pain conditions, glaucoma, or they're just saying they are in order to get the prescription, in order to get the drug. That the abusers, that's the ones I want you to address, that question.
Well, I think it's tough to say in California. There is some abuse going on, I'm sure, but given that marijuana costs less off the street in the illicit market than it does inside of a dispensary where you could get it safely and legally, it's not worth it to many people. And so I think the abuse is heavily exaggerated. Now, in other states besides California, the requirements for how you could use marijuana therapeutically are much more restrictive, and I think that again the abuse is exaggerated and can be controlled. I mean, that shouldn't be an excuse to eliminate a medical marijuana law altogether is because someone fears abuse in the system, especially for such a benign substance as marijuana.
How would you control to determine who has a legitimate medical reason? Would it be doctors to determine, okay, so there'd be the ones who would decide someone, and I guess when you think about it, that's true of all drugs. I mean, doctors can prescribe morphine, they can prescribe codeine. You can always have a couple renegade doctors, but they can lose their licenses if they prescribe things that the patient doesn't need.
Sure, and there are medical boards set up to oversee the protocol of physicians and how they interact with their patients. But at the end of the day, the decision as to whether a patient uses marijuana therapeutically should be between that physician and that patient, no one else.
Now, today's show is devoted not just to medical marijuana, but to recreational use. Why shouldn't people be free to do whatever they want as long as they're not harming anybody else? And we're going to be talking about that at length and the juvenile justice system and so forth. Chris, do you or does Americans for Safe Access have a position on the recreational use of the drug? People who admittedly don't need it medically but want to enjoy the drug just like people might enjoy alcohol or cigarettes.
Well, we don't really take a position, but we also don't stand in the way of drug policy efforts on that front. And we welcome a more compassionate and sane drug policy in the United States that doesn't lock up literally thousands of people on a regular basis.
What is the policy today on medical marijuana? I think most people recognize that 18 states in D.C. allow marijuana for some medical use, but the federal government does not, and under the Constitution, the federal government trumps the state governments. So what happens in California and other states when you have a state that says it's legal and the federal government says it isn't legal? What's going on? Are people being arrested in massive numbers by the federal government? Is the Obama administration less enforcing of these laws than the Bush administration? What's happening on the ground today with medical marijuana?
Well, I wish President Obama were keeping his pledge to not go after medical marijuana growers and distributors. Unfortunately, the Obama administration has taken a very aggressive stance on medical marijuana and is arresting and prosecuting dozens of people. Now that's at the federal level, but you have to realize that most enforcement activity concerning marijuana happens at the local and state level. But
in the 18 states in D.C. where medical marijuana is allowed, I assume state authorities are not prosecuting medical marijuana. Is that right?
By and large, they are not in states that have legalized its use. However, because the federal government still remains adamant that marijuana has no medical value, the federal government classifies it as what's called a Schedule I substance, on par with heroin in its potential for abuse and lacking medical efficacy. So that stance has actually caused confusion among law enforcement at the local level, and so it's not as simple as immunizing people from arrest and prosecution. People still get harassed, arrested, and prosecuted, unfortunately, because of this state-federal conflict or confusion. Now, the federal government has the discretion to come in and make arrests, but also the Supreme Court did not invalidate medical marijuana laws when it gave the federal government that discretion. So you have this weird effect where you have both laws existing together simultaneously, and one doesn't necessarily trump the other, but it allows the federal government to enforce federal marijuana laws and allows states to eke out protection for those patients.
Chris, where should marijuana be scheduled? Schedule I is the most dangerous group of drugs. Is this Schedule II, something like morphine? Is that Schedule II? Where do you think marijuana should be classified as a medical drug?
Well, we filed a lawsuit not too long ago arguing that marijuana should be reclassified to, at minimum, a Schedule III, if not lower. And that would recognize medical use and also recognize that it has a low potential for abuse.
So what would be another Schedule III drug, just to give people an understanding of what that means?
Well, Marinol, for example, what I mentioned earlier is the THC pill. That is Schedule 3.
Like
so
Sudafed? Is that like the decongestant that now is a prescription? Would that be Schedule 3? I'm just trying to get an idea of where that lies for a drug that many Americans have used. Would it be...
Well, you know, unfortunately, I don't have the list of Schedule 3 substances in front of me, but they are going to be, some of those will be over-the-counter
stuff you get at a drugstore, basically. I can go into a drugstore with a prescription and get it, and that's what you'd like to see.
Correct.
Okay, Chris, we only got a few minutes left. Is there anything I've left out of the discussion that you feel needs to be mentioned?
Well, I think that people need to, who care about this issue, need to take it to their policymakers and make noise about this, since up to 80% of Americans support medical marijuana, but our politicians in the United States are out of step with popular will on this issue. So make some noise with your policymakers and let them know that it's important that we change the laws on medical marijuana.
Support is definitely growing. Chris, how can people find out more about Americans for Safe Access? Tell me about your website.
Well, it's really easy to go visit and find out more at americansforsafeaccess.org. americansforsafeaccess.org. Chris Hermes, thank you very much for coming here and sharing your wisdom on the Inside Scoop. I really appreciate it. All right, coming up next, we're going to hear the other side. This is a pre-recorded interview I had with Dr. Kevin Sabet. He is with the Office of National Drug Control Policy. He is the head of the Drug Policy Institute at University of Florida. He worked under 3 presidents that don't agree on much: Clinton, George W. Bush, and President Obama, all in combating drug use, and you're going to hear a very different view from him. He's coming up next, and then we've got 3 other guests. If you want to call in, I want to encourage you to do so. You can chat with me on this issue, and I'd like to talk with you. 202-889-9797, 202-889-9797, or 888-488-MARK, toll free 888-488-6275. We'll be right back right after this.
You're listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Hello, this is Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and I want to tell you about my new favorite discovery, Yosemite National Park. I recently went there with my husband and children, and we walked the trails to see the breathtaking waterfalls, admired the grand meadows and giant sequoias. But the future of our national parks is uncertain. Many challenges face our parks today, from polluted air and water to development threats outside their borders and inadequate funding to protect our national heritage. That's why the National Parks Conservation Association recently completed a decade-long assessment of the challenges facing our national parks, along with proposed actions that will ensure our children and grandchildren will be able to enjoy the parks as we have. Our national parks have inspired Americans for nearly 100 years. As we approach the centennial of the National Park Service in 2016, please join us in helping to protect our national park legacy. Find out how at www.mpca.org.
Hello world, it's your boy, Richard. Every night when I get home, I find myself quite thirsty. Thirsty for an adult beverage, and that is why I prefer a tall glass of organic wine from the Organic Wine Company. Founded in 1972, the Organic Wine Company is the nation's oldest importer of organically produced wines. They have a tremendous selection: red, white, sparkling, and dessert wines, and it's oh so tasty. It's easy and inexpensive to ship right to your door. For a limited time, you can get an even bigger savings by visiting ecowines.com and using the coupon code FowlerShow. Join the movement of good-tasting, earth-friendly wine drinkers, led by the fine folks at the Organic Wine Company. You can find them online at ecowines.com or give them a call, 1-888-ECOWINES.com, and don't forget to use that coupon code FowlerShow for your extra special discount.
My name is Joe Thompson. I'm 29 years old and I have a career that I love as a systems analyst. Career. It still sounds cool to say that word. I never could have gotten on his path without a college degree. And if the college me were here, he'd tell you.
I never would have gotten to college without big brothers, big sisters. I could have ended up anywhere, on the streets even. But college? Joe Thompson? Not likely. My big brother helped me out. He taught me I could do anything, at a time when a lot of people were saying just the opposite.
And to a 7-year-old, that means a lot. My big brother's name is Phil. And Phil is the reason that this 7-year-old grows up to be a systems analyst.
Whether you donate money or time, you're helping Big Brothers Big Sisters help a child. And that can last a lifetime. Start something today at bigbrothersbigsisters.org. Brought to you by Big Brothers Big Sisters and the Ad Council.
You're listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Anyway, if you like the music that comes into the show, that is a Spanish artist by the name of Javier Suarez, and he provides everything copyright-free, and you can find his music and listen to all those wonderful things. This is The Inside Scoop. This is Mark Levine. We're talking about drug control policy, and my next guest, this was a pre-recorded interview I did yesterday, has been called the quarterback of the anti-drug movement. We want to present all sides on The Inside Scoop. I hope you enjoy my interview with Dr. Kevin Sabet. Served the Bush, the Clinton, and the Obama administration in the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Dr. Kevin Sabet has been dubbed the quarterback of the new anti-drug movement by Salon magazine. And as the director of the Drug Policy Institute at the University of Florida, a professor there who teaches in the psychiatry department, Dr. Sabet certainly knows he has an uphill battle ahead of him. There are now 18 states and the District of Columbia that have legalized some form of use of marijuana, with, of course, the most recent election in Colorado and Washington State allowing full recreational use. And while it's still not legal under federal law, there's definitely, let's just say, for this quarterback, he's facing some difficulties getting farther and farther away from his goalposts. I'll stop talking now and introduce Dr. Kevin Sabet. Dr. Sabet, thank you so much for coming here on The Inside Scoop.
Oh, thanks, Mark. I appreciate you having me on.
So when did you first start getting into drug control efforts? How does someone get involved in this kind of thing?
Well, actually, I was involved in what's called a drug-free community coalition in my county. And those coalitions are a marriage of prevention, treatment, and law enforcement. And there was a newspaper as part of that coalition, a student newspaper, and I think around 14 or 15 I got involved in that and escalated from there. I was at Berkeley for undergrad, and that also piqued my interest. So it was, it was a lot of different things. I got a little lucky meeting the right people on the way as well.
One of the things I try to do in any interview is make my own biases clear. So I will tell you that I have never smoked a joint in my life, nor have I ever smoked any tobacco or used any illegal drug. I've had alcohol in moderation, and yet I believe that, at least with regards to marijuana, we probably should legalize it, tax it, and regulate it. So what that means, I guess, is I'm persuadable, right? Because personally, I recognize this stuff is bad for me. I don't want this in my system. At the same time, I kind of believe that as long as someone's not harming somebody else, we should leave them alone. And I would certainly ban, pot smoking and driving, just like drinking and driving laws. I'm fine with those. And I wouldn't hire a stoner either to work for me.
Right.
Yet, at the other hand, after Prohibition, I recognize that there's some real dangers to the drug war. So let me go through the dangers of the drug, and then let's talk about the dangers of the drug war and try to figure out how we can deal with both, actually. So let's start with the drug. Tobacco kills 400,000 Americans or so a year.
At least.
How many people does marijuana kill a year in America?
Well, there aren't numbers in terms of how marijuana may indirectly kill people. Of course, tobacco doesn't directly kill in terms of intoxication. So let's be very clear. You cannot smoke yourself to death in one sitting like you can, let's say, inject yourself to death with heroin or snort yourself to death with cocaine. So let's be very clear. It's about as accurate to say that marijuana doesn't kill anybody as tobacco doesn't kill anybody, because marijuana does have, for example, doubles your risk of a car crash, according to the British Medical Journal. It sends about 400,000 people a year to the emergency room, according to the U.S. Health Human Services. It's directly tied to mental illness.
Okay,
So
let's back it up and let's deal with those one at a time, because I'm very big into detail. So I agree you don't smoke yourself to death, tobacco use, but 1/3 of tobacco users end up dying from tobacco. That's the statistics I've read.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, tobacco is the most addictive, most deadly drug we have. So I'm not here to dispute that. But we should also remember that tobacco does not produce intoxication.
That's true. That's true. Marijuana has some of the qualities of tobacco and some of the qualities of alcohol.
That's right.
Now, you mentioned you're twice as likely to die in a car crash if you're high.
Right.
I suspect, I don't know the statistics, you probably do, that you're 3 or 4 times more likely to die in a car crash if you're drunk, right? I mean, alcohol is more dangerous for driving than marijuana for driving?
You know, when it really, I actually not, in terms of one-to-one, I'm not sure. The studies show that together, of course, alcohol and marijuana, which are often used together, is more harmful than alcohol alone or marijuana alone. The problem is a lot of kids think that because you drive maybe less aggressively, because alcohol makes you more aggressive, marijuana you can argue makes you less aggressive in many ways. So people think, well, you drive slower, so you drive better. A lot of kids have the false perception that driving 20 in a 65 isn't as dangerous as driving 100 in a 65, when in reality it is.
Well, I happen to know a prosecutor who prosecutes drunk driving. And he says actually most drunk drivers also drive slowly. I guess it depends on how alcohol affects your system. My question for you this, though, is I certainly do not advocate, I don't know of any drug legalization advocates that advocate making it legal to smoke marijuana and drive, just like most of us agree with the drug driving laws.
No, I agree with you. However, I know plenty of advocates who downplay the harms of marijuana and driving, and I know plenty of people that, as a result of listening to those advocates, think that, well, it probably is safer, and then they have this sort of strange, what I think is some strange logic in saying that alcohol is more dangerous, just period, therefore marijuana should be illegal. That's like saying my windshield wiper is broken in my car, so I'm going to break my gas gasket so we can be consistent. And my finger's broken, so I'm going to break my toe. It makes absolutely no sense. The bottom line is, for policy purposes, alcohol and marijuana are very different in that alcohol, of course, has a widespread history of accepted use across all cultures dating back thousands of years. Marijuana has been used for thousands of years, but not in that widespread manner. We treat alcohol, differently. Some could say that's hypocritical. Frankly, it's to our peril. I mean, 100,000 people dead a year because of alcohol, a significant tide of violence, even more than crack cocaine. My issue with marijuana is that if you look at alcohol and tobacco as models of regulation, like people do, they are not models of regulation at all. For every dollar collected in alcohol and tobacco tax, we spend 10 in social costs.
But you would not ban or restrict alcohol or tobacco any more than they already are, or would you?
I think alcohol could be definitely more restricted than it currently is.
How would you restrict alcohol more than?
Well, first of all, you could get much tougher on problematic binge drinkers. You could get much tougher on the liquor lobby. Listen, Mark, you and I, we know Washington. We know the power of the alcohol lobby. Do you know that today's liquor taxes are 1/5 of what they were during the Korean War when you adjust for inflation? And that's not because Congress forgot to raise taxes. That's because we have a very powerful lobby who fights any tax increase tooth and nail because they know that any increase results in a decrease of their use.
And that's true. That's true of tobacco taxes. That's true of gasoline taxes. That's true.
Tobacco, even though we also spend 1-to-10 ratio, we have record high taxes on tobacco because of the settlements. Still, tobacco is used by far more people than marijuana, about 4 times as many people, even with all the anti-tobacco stuff. So I don't see alcohol and tobacco as any kind of models. The idea that we'd make money off of legalizing marijuana, and it makes absolutely no sense when you look at the economics of our legal drugs today. It's a bad argument, but it's one that unfortunately persuades a lot of smart people who think that this might be a moneymaker in these economic times.
I guess the issue is you can range all drugs, all substances. All of them have their dangers.
That's right.
Caffeine certainly has some addictive qualities.
Sure.
Lots of Americans drink coffee.
Yeah.
I happen to like diet soda myself.
Yeah.
And I think it's less dangerous than alcohol, tobacco, or marijuana. Conversely, heroin, cocaine, PCP, there's a lot of drugs, LSD, that I would think we'd all agree are more dangerous than alcohol, tobacco, or marijuana. So in trying to decide, as a policy analyst, as you are, and worked in the government, we do a lot. We do some legal things. No one is suggesting any bans on caffeine, and there's some things that we all agree should be banned. Why isn't it fair then to compare marijuana to the two most dangerous drugs that are legal, alcohol and tobacco?
We just have to be honest about what harms that we're using. So when you say more dangerous, we need to say more dangerous based on what criteria and compared to what. So, again, marijuana, more dangerous than tobacco for driving. Marijuana, more dangerous than tobacco for childcare and for secondary costs. Tobacco, more dangerous than marijuana, I would even say, for lung cancer and lung obstruction. Alcohol, more dangerous than crack cocaine when it comes to violence. So, we can compare. We just have to be very clear about what the criteria is and then what that means for policy. What I look at today, I look at three classes of legal drugs: alcohol, tobacco, and by the way, don't forget prescription drugs, which are more controlled. You got to have $1 million education to hand out a prescription drug. It's not, so these three different, and they're all different in terms of their regulation model. On public health grounds, alcohol and tobacco are undoubtedly an unmitigated disaster.
Well, they are. As we talked about, 400,000 Americans die a year from tobacco use. 1 out of 3 Americans who smoke die from that smoking. Can you give me any kind of statistics? You've been in this, and you know these statistics better than anybody, certainly better than I do. Can you give me a rough guess? I know there's some 30,000 Americans that die due to gun violence. How many, are we talking 10,000, 5,000? How many Americans can we say dead from marijuana?
Again, I don't know that number. We'd have to look at marijuana-related crashes, first of all. But let me tell you what your prosecutor friend would also tell you, who does car crashes, would tell you that oftentimes people have marijuana and alcohol in their system, but when the alcohol test comes up 3 times the legal limit, the testing stops from there. There isn't a pursuit in court because marijuana does not have a .08 equivalent. It's very difficult, actually, to even measure that. What the British Medical Journal did when they found out that when they concluded that doubles your risk for a car crash, is they looked at every single study done in the last 20-some years, and they sorted the ones that were best, and they said, we took the extremes out of either side, based on the average, we're looking at a doubling. The Annals of Epidemiology did the exact same thing, and they came to the exact same conclusion. So, that's one.
Can I take out car crashes and just ask how many people? For smoking, it's pretty clear. People could say they got lung cancer, they got a stroke, they smoked.
We're still learning about the lung cancer and the other links with marijuana. The lung cancer stuff, like I said, is very mixed. I actually think we're with marijuana where we were 50 years ago with tobacco. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that we have a powerful lobby that estimates the harms of marijuana and inadvertently increases use by spreading the message that this drug is harmful. We have that lobby already, and it's going to get more and more powerful with over time if we have legalization. Let me tell you something, Mark. If legalization was about my old friends at Berkeley, hanging out on Telegraph Avenue in a drum circle, smoking a little weed and singing Kumbaya, I really could care less. The bottom line is, this is about big business and big money. I get an email in my inbox every day from Medical Marijuana Business Daily. The amount of bragging that they do about the billions of dollars this industry is already making and what people need to do to profit even more is unbelievable. And so if people think that this is going to be about, ex-hippies smoking without fear of police, they're totally wrong. We are going to have big marijuana just like we had big tobacco. And let me tell you one more thing before I finish this line of thought, Mark, is that when you look at the liquor industry today, for example, why are there 4 times as many liquor stores in black neighborhoods than white neighborhoods? Why are there more lottery dispensaries in Hispanic neighborhoods than white neighborhoods? Why does a liquor company target Compton and not Bel Air or Beverly Hills, which has a lot more disposable income? Because the most vulnerable people are the ones that don't write the checks, $50,000 checks to the Betty Ford Clinic. They don't have the means to do that. They're struggling to make ends meet, and they are vulnerable. If we think that the big marijuana industry is not going to target the underserved and communities of color, we have something else coming. So that's why it pains me when I see good liberals like your old boss, Barney Frank, buy into the rhetoric that this is going to be helping people who I know he cares most about.
Although, to be fair about my old boss, he only supported a bill to legalize medical marijuana, and I want to get to medical marijuana in just a second.
Sure.
But let me just ask you the question about marijuana use. If you can't quantify deaths, and if we know that alcohol and tobacco, we can actually quantify those more. How do we study these things? I mean, one of the things that Barney Frank pointed out, let me just say real quick, one of the things that he pointed out was that there's actually the government banned even studying this thing, which we have to know whether it has medical uses and things like that. You're not opposed to studying it.
He controlled the budgets. That is the biggest myth I've ever heard. That's almost as big of a myth as saying people are we're spending law enforcement resources on imprisoning people with marijuana. Those two, I would say, are the top two myths. I will go to those two issues in a second, but what I wanted to say is death isn't the only thing we're concerned about when it comes to public health, public policy, and money. I think 400,000 emergency room admissions is an issue. I think a direct connection to mental illness is an issue. I think a direct connection to IQ. I'm not sure if your viewing audience knows this, but 3 months ago, the most important study ever done on marijuana and learning was conducted. And this was a population-level study in New Zealand that found that if you were a heavy, persistent marijuana smoker when you were young, by the time you were 38, you had an average of 8 points IQ less than those who hadn't smoked. So an 8-point IQ loss takes you from the top 1/3 of the population to the bottom 1/3. It's a very big deal. These are people that stopped using when they were in their 20s. They had used heavily when they were young, and by 38, they had a significant IQ loss compared to non-users. So that, I think, matters, even if we can't quantify the number of deaths.
Could you say the same thing for people who overuse alcohol?
Actually, no. I'm so glad you asked that, because I would have forgotten that caveat, Mark. The same researchers looked at alcohol because they actually have wonderful data on multiple factors: socioeconomic, educational attainment, parental involvement. They looked at all of this. Alcohol, guess what the effect was on IQ? 0.
If you're a heavy drinker?
Actually, you know what they actually found was that...
I thought it killed brain cells. Is that what they told you?
You know what they found is that people who abstain from alcohol, like me, and maybe this explains something, have lower IQs than those who...
I drink in moderation, so I guess I win on this score.
You're in good shape. They said that that's probably because those abstainers, many of them were former, total binge drinker alcoholics that had suffered some damages. But the moderate to even heavy drinkers did not have IQ loss. The marijuana smokers did. Look, that's only... I realize it's a very good study because it's over 40 years, but that is only one. There are other studies and other things. Death isn't the only thing we're concerned about.
Fair enough. And I want to make clear, I'm not advocating marijuana use.
I agree.
What I'm trying to do as a policymaker is analyze the relative harms versus...
Got it.
And one of the things that you point out, and I think you're quite right about, is how much more dangerous marijuana is than it was in your days at Berkeley or 45th. You're probably not that old.
Not that old. Watch it.
But let's just say in the 60s and the 70s, when the drug culture began, it was much less dangerous. So let me ask you this. Wouldn't it be better, instead of having unregulated, and it's very easy to get marijuana across the country, I know you know this, and any 16-year-old, 14-year-old who wants it can get it, wouldn't it be better then to tax it, regulate it, bring down those levels to the levels they were in the Berkeley years? So it'd be 1/5 of the levels today. Make sure it's not laced with something. Regulation, tax it, and so that people get it in the Berkeley quantities rather than today's quantities.
Yeah. You're exactly right that today's weed is not your Woodstock weed of the 60s and 70s. It's also not the weed of the 80s. I mean, we're talking 4 to 5, depending on the year that you're looking at, and people try to call me out. Hey, Kevin, you said 4 times greater, and then you said 7 times greater. Well, it depends on what you're looking at. So if you're looking at the mid-80s, we're looking at about 4 times greater THC levels. That is a major problem, and that's why we see more kids in treatment for marijuana today than all drugs combined, Mark, including alcohol. So yes, the higher THC is a problem. Now, to your question of would it be better to regulate it and get our hands around it, maybe control some of this, lower the THC, and then we'll at least have less harmful marijuana.
There you go.
Sounds wonderful in practice, but you know what? Guess what? Not going to happen for a couple of reasons. I'll give you a few of the reasons. One, marijuana is used at far less than our legal drugs. So if we want to increase marijuana use, make it cheaper, more accessible even than it is now, more normalized and much easier to get, then we would want to legalize it. And so we would want to, quote unquote, control and regulate it, because that's what we do with alcohol and tobacco, and those drugs are used 4 to 6 times greater than marijuana. Number one.
We can tax it highly so that it keeps up. If you're worried about lower prices,
what's going to happen in the black market? then what's going to happen to the black market? You're going to still have one. And guess what? That black market is going to sell the THC that the government is saying we're not selling because we're being responsible.
That's true. But wouldn't some users choose to have, I mean, there's certainly people who want marijuana but don't want it laced with some really dangerous drugs that sometimes happens on the black market.
Marijuana, the average marijuana smoker is not experiencing marijuana that's laced with something. I mean, the issue is if you can go to any of these dispensaries in California and Colorado, and we're going to talk about medical in a minute, and say that you have a headache or stress, which is what 44% of people in a recent study who use medical marijuana said, and you can get any kind of marijuana you want, any strain that you want. God knows what's in it, but supposedly they tested it. The issue is,
my point is we could regulate it. We could require those dispensaries. I mean, and I'm not just talking about, and we'll talk about medical, as you say, in a minute. But I'm just saying you could bring down the levels under the government-sanctioned marijuana program to the levels they were in the 60s.
Mark,
you could make sure that it's
peak of marijuana use. Hold on. In the 70s, we peaked on marijuana use in the late 70s when normal was ascending, when we had multiple states towards legalization. In 1979, we had twice as many in terms of population marijuana smokers than today among 12th graders. We had I think it's either 2 to 3 times more daily marijuana smokers than we do today. I mean, so the levels in the late 70s are not levels we want to go back to.
I was talking about the levels of the drug. I was talking about the drug was less dangerous than it is today.
I see. But
therefore, it seems to me that there are people out there, maybe not all of them, but there are many people who would rather have, people that drink 3.2 beer, right? There are people who would rather say, I know this marijuana is not safe, but safer than the stuff I get on the street.
They can smoke the Mexican ditchweed and get lower THC. It's not hard to find lower THC on the market today. I understand the motive of trying to control. And
it's legal. It'd be legal. People would say, "Hey, I'll take the legal thing that won't put me in jail rather than the stuff on the street that could."
So let's go talk about that. The average smoker is not going to jail. Let's be very clear. 0.1% of state prisons population is there for marijuana possession only. We're talking about people who get arrested because they're driving erratically. They have a busted taillight. Their registration hasn't been renewed in 3 years. And then when the cop pulls them over, they see a bong in the car. They smell marijuana. They get cited for marijuana. They may spend 1 to 2 days in jail for that. Then they're released on their own recognizance and they're ordered to pay a $300 fine. That's the average experience for people with marijuana only. So,
well, 1 second though. I mean, many people that are busted for marijuana are busted because they bought $20 worth and sold "quote unquote" $10 to their friends, and so they get there for sale too. I mean, we're not talking.
If not $20, but you know what?
Okay, $100. But my point is that I guess my question for you is non-violent drug offenders.
Right.
I've seen statistics, but you know them better than I do, to show that as many as a sixth of our people in jail are nonviolent drug offenders, and that would include all drugs,
right.
But no violence. Is that right, or would you think that's not right?
Okay, that is right. However, they're not in jail for drugs. So let's be clear. They're nonviolent drug offenders. Okay, so let's just stay with nonviolent drug offenders with nonviolent offenders serving time for their drug offense. It's confusing, but they're different. We did an analysis in the Obama administration of who's actually in state prison for all drugs. The reason was drug possession. In other words, if it was legal, they would not be there. The answer was 6% when you looked at all drugs combined.
Do you include sale? Or you just said possession. So you got to, if you add sale,
drug offenses, possession.
So drug possession or sale.
Yeah, I actually have and I can learn to do this on Skype. I have slides that show this. But essentially, yes, we're talking about sale, and it's just far less than anybody wants to often think. There are people that are arrested. Now, let's be clear here. I'm not saying that we want to use the criminal justice system, or even that arrests are something to say, what's the big deal? Because if you are arrested, you can often have a black mark on your record that hurts you for getting a job in the future. So I'm not here to gloss over that very serious outcome, Mark, but my argument with Project Sam, and we haven't talked about that, but the reason why someone, a very close buddy of your former boss, Barney Frank, Patrick Kennedy, joined Project Sam, and many doctors and famous researchers from around the world, is because we want a different conversation about marijuana, Mark. The conversation right now is our choices are legalization or putting everybody in jail. And we reject that dichotomy. We actually think that there's third way. We don't use in jail, but not in jail anyway.
That's the interview. It actually got a little garbled there. We did this over Skype, but that's the heart of my interview with Dr. Kevin Sabet. I hope you find it very interesting. He went on to say that he rejected the dichotomy between saying, incarcerate everyone who ever smokes marijuana and legalize and regulate it. He argued for what you might call in-between ideas, sending people for treatment and things like that. And actually that becomes a great segue to my next guest, Dr. Jeremy Hale, who's the General Advocacy Counsel for the Sentencing Project, because the question is, all right, there are bad things that marijuana does to you, just like there are bad things that alcohol and cigarettes do to you, and I've never disputed that, but the question is, should we punish people who smoke marijuana, and if so, how? How do we get people to do what's right for themselves? I did ask Dr. Sabet in the part of the interview that isn't heard because of the audio problems. I did say to him, if someone's out in the woods smoking marijuana and not harming anybody, does that bother you? And he said, no, not at all. That's fine, as long as it's not harming anybody else. But we live in society where there's, just like there's secondhand smoke for cigarettes, something that I personally am concerned about. There's also secondary harms. Someone who's high, who mistreats their children or so forth, just like we have harms for alcoholics, or who go ahead and drive. So the question now becomes, all right, this is a harm to society. How harmful it is something we may disagree on, but what should our government do to prevent these harms, if anything at all? And to answer that question coming up, I've got Jeremy Hale. He's the Federal Advocacy Counsel for the Sentencing Project. Now, this is quite an extraordinary young man. He has spent much of his life helping those who are most left out of our society. He's not only someone who was in the Peace Corps in Armenia, but someone who has actively spent time helping the homeless in America. And in fact, he's a board member of the National Coalition for the Homeless. And this is a guy who's really studied all aspects of the criminal justice system, everything from incarceration to juvenile justice, racial disparities, and so forth. I know he's got a strong view on drug policy. So do we have Jeremy Hale on the line here?
Hey, Mark. This is Jeremy.
Hi, Jeremy. Welcome so much. Thanks for coming here on the Inside Scoop. Now, I don't know how much you heard of my interview with Doctors Kevin Sabet of National Drug Control Policy. But his argument is, look, this stuff does have real dangers, and that really the punishment isn't so severe that, if you're picked up for a broken taillight, you might be arrested for marijuana use when the police officer sees a bong in the car, but you'll only go 1 or 2 days in jail, and you'll be released, and it's not that big a deal. I take it you disagree.
Well, we do disagree. One of the biggest problems with our marijuana laws that we have are the racial disparities that we see in the way that they are enforced. So in a city like New York City, we see that upwards of 80% of folks who are arrested for marijuana possession are people of color. And so for that reason alone, I think there's cause for concern about the laws that we have on the books and how they're enforced.
Well, let me ask you about that and think about why that is. Is that because people of color are more likely to be using it on the street or, in a place where cops might see them use it, whereas upper middle class white people who smoke marijuana are doing it behind closed doors in a home? Or do you think there's something more nefarious going on, cops actively looking for drug use in African-American, Latino communities that they're not looking for in white communities?
I think that part of it is that in lower-income urban communities, the drug use and trade of drugs sometimes tends to be on the street, whereas in middle-class neighborhoods, perhaps it's inside the home. But imagine a white middle-class family that discovers that perhaps their son or daughter is using or selling drugs. And in that case, the parents, may seek drug treatment that may be covered by their family's health insurance plan. And now imagine a working-class African-American family without insurance or access to treatment. Their son gets picked up in a random neighborhood sweep, which happens, in more low-income communities of color. and ends up before a prosecutor who charges him with a crime that carries a 5-year mandatory sentence.
Now, what would be like a random neighborhood sweep? You mean just police officers looking? I mean, these are people who are outdoors smoking. Are people actually going into homes to get drug users?
Well, we've seen over the years in various cities policies for community policing and hotspot policing, and some of these policies include sort of police sweeps of entire neighborhoods.
What does a police sweep entail? I guess I'm not from a lower income neighborhood. I don't know. What does that mean, a police sweep?
The police department, as I understand it, sends out officers and has for it to be constitutional, as I understand it, has to have a systematic policy or program for basically searching folks in those communities. And when you search a lot of people in a community, you're more likely to find perhaps drugs in somebody's pocket that you wouldn't.
I'm just trying to understand how it goes down. The police see a group of youngsters who are talking to each other on a street corner and actually says, hey, we heard a drug deal went down on this corner 2 weeks ago. We want to search your pockets to see if you have marijuana involved. Or are we talking about cops actually seeing people smoking or even going into people's homes? How does it work?
Well, I mean, one problem we have is the stop and frisk policy that we see in New York City, where officers really need very little reason to stop and search a person's pockets. A furtive movement, is part of the standard, and these sort of policies aren't carried out, perhaps in Georgetown, in Washington, where I live.
Right. I would doubt they would go and see some white guy in Georgetown make a furtive movement into a restaurant and claim that's a problem. Now, do you think this is really a socioeconomic problem, that basically police go into poor neighborhoods for drug shakedowns and don't go into rich neighborhoods? Or would you say it's beyond socioeconomics and really is actively racial? That in other words, they go more into poor black neighborhoods than poor white neighborhoods?
Well, I think that, they're mixed. And I think that, the vast majority of police officers are not consciously racially biased. But because of the way that our society is uneven, by race, there's often an overlap between entering poor communities and entering, communities of color.
Now, you've done a lot of work with the homeless. I take it the homeless are the clearest example of people who have no place to go. If a person with a home uses marijuana, they're doing it behind closed doors. They're far less likely to be stopped by police. If you're homeless, you have to do it out in the elements or in a shelter. And so drug use may be the same, but if you're homeless, you're going to be arrested. And if you have a home, chances are 90+% you're not going to be.
That's true, and it goes beyond really arrest, too, because once an individual enters the criminal justice system, then these sort of issues of race and class play out, at each successive stage. So a more prosperous individual, or a young person with parents who can hire a good lawyer, is more likely to be able to plea out, perhaps to probation or community service or drug treatment, whereas a poor individual doesn't have that advantage and is more likely to end up charged with these harsher sentences by prosecutors.
How harsh can the sentences be? One of the things that Dr. Sabet said was you might spend a day or two in jail, which obviously a day or two in jail isn't a pleasant thing. Can you, for possession of marijuana, be charged much more severely than that?
There's certainly, depending on the sentencing guidelines, there are certainly pretty substantial penalties that a person can receive for marijuana, depending on the amount. Sometimes these are enhanced by a person, carrying a gun when they make a marijuana trade, and then also the way our country's conspiracy laws work. Often you have folks who are really lower level members of what is considered a drug conspiracy, prosecuted because they're the only ones in the conspiracy who can't give the prosecutors information and get a lesser charge.
So let's talk numbers here. How many Americans are incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses? I think you'd agree with me that I don't personally have much sympathy for people who are involved in violent crimes related to or not related to the drug trade. If you shoot somebody, you assault somebody, you beat somebody up, you brandish a gun and threaten to kill someone, I don't care whether you're selling drugs or not, I don't have much sympathy for you. But I do have a lot of sympathy for nonviolent drug users and to some extent even drug sellers who are, although I have more sympathy for drug users than drug sellers. What kind of numbers are we talking about for nonviolent drug offenders?
Sure. Well, the Congressional Research Service issued a report earlier this year that showed that the largest portion of newly admitted inmates into our federal prison system are being incarcerated for drug offenses. So currently we have about 2.1 million individuals incarcerated in prisons and jails. And at the federal level, prisoners incarcerated on a drug charge comprise about half of the prison population.
Half of the prison population on a drug charge at the federal level. What percentage of those are nonviolent?
Nonviolent. It's not clear exactly what that means, because a person can be considered violent just because they have, say, a gun on, an ankle holster when they are trading drugs. And so, if you were just to try to isolate the folks who are just there for possession or use, it's not a huge proportion of the prison population, but it's significant.
How, can you give me some numbers on that? Let's just do possession or use. Sure. Then that's the simplest one. People who are not selling the drugs, or at worst are buying a nickel bag, buying some drugs and selling half of it to their friends. But people who aren't involved in the drug trade as a way to make a living, but are arrested for possession or use, or actually jailed. What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Right. Well, in a recent year, of those charged with marijuana violations, about 88% were charged with possession only, and that was about 800,000 Americans, and 750,000 Americans.
And even if they don't go to jail, you're arrested, you could lose your job. I mean, these have severe consequences even if you don't go to jail, right?
Well, and that's one of the problems with the war on drugs, is the sort of collateral consequences that come after you've been incarcerated. So a lot of employers have sort of blanket policies against hiring individuals with a criminal record. In some cases, even any person who's ever been arrested. And we know, again, that people of color are much more likely to be arrested than others.
So when Kevin Sabet says, you spend a day or two in jail and then you're out, he's neglecting the fact that a day or two in jail means that any time you get a questionnaire from an employer, have you ever been incarcerated, and you have to say yes, even if it's a day or two, that could mean very likely you're not going to be hired for the job.
That's exactly what that means. And you may also lose your right to vote. You may lose your right to receive certain government services, and it makes it more likely that when you can't vote, you can't get housing, you can't find a job, that you're more likely to turn to criminal activities to make a living.
Yeah, that's the other thing. If you're incarcerated with a bunch of murderers and rapists and thieves, you're more likely to take up those trades, and then someone, just an ordinary drug user. So what is your answer, Jeremy, to these problems? I don't think you're saying that drug use has no harmful effects. Do you think there should ever be any kind of government intervention to stop marijuana or more serious drug use? And if so, what should that intervention be?
Well, we do have other options to incarceration. For example, a study in California showed that $1 invested in substance abuse treatment saved $7 by reducing crime and hospitalization. And a number of studies have shown that community-based treatment and prevention works better than prison at reducing drug abuse. So we'd like to see more treatment of drug users rather than incarceration of drug users.
Of course, a lot of drug users, Jeremy, don't want treatment. Would you be okay with requiring, even forcing, even lock-up treatment centers? In other words, we won't send them to jail, but if someone doesn't want to stop their habit, would you consider even locking them up in a treatment center for a period of time, or do you think that's too strong a solution, too negative an idea?
I think it should be on the table. I mean, we all agree, most of us agree that the war on drugs has failed, but the legislation and the responses to the drug laws we have on the books need to be thought through. And so if marijuana were legalized nationwide tomorrow, we'd probably see an increase in the number of users. Most probably would use it responsibly, but we need to acknowledge that some would not. And that increased drug abuse is a legitimate concern.
Would you make a distinction between marijuana use and cocaine, heroin, LSD, more serious drug uses, more dangerous drugs, and argue the more likelihood, I guess, of a lockup treatment center if you are addicted to LSD or heroin or cocaine than, say, marijuana?
I think certainly marijuana has less harmful consequences associated with its use. But, all of these drugs help drive, combine to drive our ghastly incarceration rates in this country. So, I think all of these drugs need to be part of the debate about decriminalization, and we need to think about how that we respond.
One of my main concerns about the drug war is violence, and I'm not just talking about over-incarceration and violence by police and arresting people in low-income neighborhoods, but actually the violence of gang wars. I mean, you talked about someone selling marijuana, but they got a gun holstered on their ankle. Maybe you're a little more sympathetic to that person than I am. I'm concerned that gun will actually be used and that they may shoot someone, or that some innocent bystander living in that low-income neighborhood who has nothing to do with the drug trade might get caught in a shootout. My concern is that with it being illegal, like in the Prohibition era, there's a lot more violence associated with it. Do you have any ideas or solutions for dampening down the violence associated with the drug trade?
Right. Well, I think, I think you've discussed this on your program. If you're decriminalizing these drugs, there's less. In cases like Colorado and Washington, you're actually legalizing recreational use. There's less incentive. There can be less incentive for there to be a violent drug trade. Part of the, we don't totally disagree that it's problematic when you have an individual, carrying a gun, and, guns can lead to violence. The problem is that our penalties for such offenses are so disproportionate to the risk of violence or to the offense. So you have an individual in Utah, Weldon Angelos, who's spending, I believe, 50 or 60 years for 2 drug trades. He never used a gun. He had never had any prior criminal history. He carried one for protection, and now his 3 daughters don't have a father.
50 or 60 years? I don't think we give murderers that much in jail these days. That's amazing.
We don't, but the way that the federal laws are written allows for stacking up of sentences and for enhancements when there's a drug present, and we don't want to minimize as I said, the risk of violence when there is a drug, but we need to take a look at these just really, really long, excessive sentences that are the reason for our high incarceration rates.
Jeremy Hill, I wish we had more time. We're trying to get all these guests in, but you've really given me some very interesting things to think about, and I'm sure my listeners too. I want to thank you so much for coming here on the Inside Scoop.
Thanks a lot, Mark.
Okay, coming up next, we've got someone who's seen it on the ground. Jeremy Hill has studied it, but Norm Stamper is retired chief of police for Seattle, Washington, of course, the state that has legalized marijuana for recreational use. He's going to be our next guest, and he's going to talk about his ideas for law enforcement and the drug trade. If you want to call in, it's 202-889-9797. This is Mark Levine, the Inside Scoop on We Act Radio, AM 1480. We will be right back right after this.
You're listening to WPWC, We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Hello, this is Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and I want to tell you about my new favorite discovery, Yosemite National Park. I recently went there with my husband and children, and we walked the trails to see the breathtaking waterfalls, admired the grand meadows, and giant sequoias. But the future of our national parks is uncertain. Many challenges face our parks today, from polluted air and water to development threats outside their borders and inadequate funding to protect our national heritage. That's why the National Parks Conservation Association recently completed a decade-long assessment of the challenges facing our national parks, along with proposed actions that will ensure our children and grandchildren will be able to enjoy the parks as we have. Our national parks have inspired Americans for nearly 100 years. As we approach the centennial of the National Park Service in 2016, please join us in helping to protect our national park legacy. Find out how at www.mpca.org.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I am Mark Levine. Welcome back to We Act Radio, 1480 AM. We're having a really fascinating discussion from a wide variety of points of views on the drug war, on marijuana use, on the real harms that the drug war does, the harms that the drug does, but also the harms that the drug war does. And the question really is, okay, we got this drug, it's dangerous. We have this drug war, it's dangerous. How do we advocate a policy that minimizes the harms of both? And the question is not just one for lawyers and policymakers, but for, well, police officers on the ground. You've just heard Jeremy Hill talk about police officers and going more into low-income neighborhoods and perhaps unequally enforcing the law. Well, I've got the retired chief of police of Seattle coming on the line right now. His name is Norm Stamper. He's been a police officer for 34 years, 28 years in San Diego, California, then 6 years as the Seattle police chief. This is a guy who knows the drug war intimately. I mean, he's been on the ground. He has helped to devote resources. And, you know, it's a real question for policymakers in Washington sitting in their ivory towers. It's quite another for cops on the street. That's why I'm really honored to have Chief Norm Stamper coming right here on the Inside Scoop. Chief Stamper, are you there on the line? Norm Stamper, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, terrific. So let me ask you, 28 years as a cop in San Diego, 6 years as police chief in Seattle. I'm sure that drug crimes were a big part of what you did as a cop, right?
They were indeed. in both cities.
Okay, so now what we just heard, I don't know if you probably didn't hear the interview I just did with Jeremy Hale, the Sentencing Project, but he just said that police do sweeps of low-income neighborhoods much more often than a high-income neighborhood, that people smoking drugs, white upper middle-class people behind closed doors are very much less likely to get arrested than lower-income people that are doing it either in the streets. Do you agree with him that that's true, and what do you think about that?
Well, it is absolutely true, and what I think of it is that it's unconscionable. And yet it's as understandable as one can imagine. If you're looking at hand-to-hand deals taking place in public areas, generating citizen complaints about drug trafficking, you're going to put pressure on that local police department to go after those offenses.
It's easier to police, basically.
I'm sorry?
It's easier to police on the street corner than up in someone's private home.
Well, low-hanging fruit comes to mind. It is definitely much easier. These street corner deals, the open-air drug markets are so visible, so conspicuous, and truth be told, they're very harmful to the neighborhood or the community, to people's sense of security, to property values and the like. So there's a need to do something. But what we're doing is not working, never has and never will.
Okay, so I assume there's a lot of violence in where drug deals go down because drug dealers are protecting their turf, I presume, from other drug dealers and in the illegal drug trade, and that's what cops are being called out to stop.
Well, that's true. I think it's safe to say that when one is involved in drug trafficking against a backdrop of the drug war and U.S. drug policy, one of the inevitable outcomes of that picture is violence. And we see it at the cartel level, at the kingpin level, and we see it at the street level.
Tell me what's going on your average American street. In San Diego, in Seattle, how many people are we talking about actually getting shot or killed on a daily basis as a result of the drug war?
Well, if we're looking at Mexico,
okay,
and I think we must, because we fuel that demand, that half of the economic equation. We're looking at literally tens of thousands of deaths. One estimate is 60,000 murders since Calderon declared his own war on drugs in Mexico. So that's about 6 or 7 years ago. In U.S. cities, we now find Mexican drug cartel presence in over 1,000 U.S. cities. And that's hard for people to imagine, but it's important for people to understand. It is happening. When you're talking about obscene, untaxed profits associated with illicit drug commerce, you are talking about people who become greedy and evil and will do just about anything to protect or expand their markets.
So how does that, let's talk about both sort of the drugs, but also the violence. Is that what leads to gang wars in the streets in America, this fighting over the drug trade?
Absolutely. Back in an earlier day, some tend to romanticize this era. We had drugs that were designed around turf. Gangs, rather, that were designed around turf. So
West Side Story, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And once again, there's a tendency to romanticize it.
Clearly.
A lot of those fights, a lot of the violence stem from one gang member looking at the girlfriend of another gang member or giving him a bad look, that sort of thing. And the level of violence associated with that era was much, much smaller than what we're seeing today. And it's all around markets and no longer that version of turf that many of us grew up with.
So how much of it is really gun regulation? I mean, after all, marijuana doesn't shoot anybody. I mean, how if we had better gun regulation, would that cut down on some of this drug violence?
Absolutely, it would. Now, I need to make a distinction here between my role as a member of law enforcement against prohibition, which takes no position on gun regulation, and my own personal view.
Okay, fair enough.
My own personal view is that I would ask you and your listeners: is there anybody in your life, somebody you know, who ought not to be walking down the street with a gun.
I can think of a few people.
I think most all of us can. And what that suggests is we absolutely need to know who's purchasing a firearm. And we need to, I think, take good, strong steps to ensure that we have a sensible regulatory system which would reduce the violence associated with drug trafficking.
Okay.
It would certainly not eliminate it.
Right, absolutely. And of course, I think part of your argument is that because these drugs are illegal, there's more crime associated with these massive profits. You can just go back to Prohibition very easily to see when a very popular drug became illegal in America, there was incredible violence. Machine Gun, John Dillinger, Machine Gun Kelly, looking at American history. But are you advocating, therefore, that all drugs should be legal? Are you still saying some drugs should be illegal? And if some drugs should still be illegal, won't we still have the illicit drug trade?
Well, think about it this way. The short answer is I'm advocating the legalization of all drugs.
All drugs, cocaine, heroin, LSD, all of them.
Yeah, the more sinister, the more frightening, the more dangerous the drug, the greater the justification to put the regulation of that drug not in the hands of the cartels, but in the admittedly imperfect hands of government, just as we did with alcohol. We will never eliminate drug abuse, whether it's alcohol or any other drug. But we can, in fact, if we've got the courage and the will, and frankly, the intelligence to look at the systemic implications of our drug policy, we will conclude that the drug cartels have no interest in carding minors, for example, and they have a great interest in selling to minors. And it's vital, I think, that we understand that by prohibiting these substances, we are guaranteeing through prohibition greed and violence and corruption. And that will never go away. We'll never be able to reduce any of that unless we are smart enough to legalize and regulate all drugs.
Well, now you say all drugs. We've had a lot of discussion prior to you coming on the air about marijuana. There's a heavy debate, as you know, in America about legalization of marijuana. Do you still live in Washington State?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so of course, in your home state and in Colorado, it has been legalized by the population for recreational use. But you go farther than, well, anyone I've had on this show so far, to legalize all drugs, cocaine, LSD. I mean, arsenic is a poison. I can think of a lot of things that are extremely dangerous. You would legalize them all and regulate them for a doctor's prescription. Give me your scheme as your policy for, say, heroin or cocaine or LSD, some of the more dangerous drugs.
Well, again, let me separate myself from law enforcement.
Right, your personal opinion, absolutely.
But, simply because that organization, of which I'm a very proud member and an advisory board member, does not take a stand on a particular regulatory model. So what you're going to be hearing is norm stampers.
Fair enough. Go ahead.
I think the government needs to step in and say to the cartels, to the street traffickers, to everyone who is enjoying enormous untaxed profits off of the transaction of these drugs, that the government is now taking it over, that the government will set regulations for purity, for quality, for packaging, for marketing. I personally favor no marketing whatsoever of these drugs. And I would personally favor a state-run establishments that would, in fact, oversee the regulation of these drugs, selling them to no minor at great risk of losing one's license. So it's very, very similar to what we see with alcohol today.
Now, the Netherlands famously, particularly Amsterdam, famously did something like this with marijuana, not necessarily with harder drugs, and they just now reversed their policy just a few months ago. Do you think that we have lessons to learn from Amsterdam, or that's an imperfect model?
Yeah, it's an imperfect model, and let me explain why.
Okay.
You have so-called coffee houses,
right,
in Amsterdam, and in fact they are still present, but there's been a real clampdown by the government because that city and that country has become a magnet for might even call it narco-tourism.
Mm-hmm.
People thinking, well, let's go to Amsterdam where we can score these drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Marijuana at the top of that list. And that was creating a real problem, not for people in country. What we found is that the Dutch young people use marijuana at about half the rate of American kids. And that's because they've normalized it and regulated it. So I think that's made a huge difference in the quality of life. But what's subtracted from that quality of life for the Dutch is this attraction of those laws that is producing a lot of ugly tourism, for lack of a better term.
I guess my question is this, and I listen, I don't claim to have an easy answer here. I realize there are no easy answers here. But it seems to me that to the extent that you legalize it, you do cut down on the cartel, the violence, but then, of course, comes the increase in the trouble from the drugs themselves. And the extent that you have any regulations, like regulation to minors, well, you can still have cartels that still sell to your 14-year-old in the street. How do we find that balance, then, between preventing the harm from the drug war and preventing the harm from the drug crimes? Would you say treatment centers are still something that the federal government should be involved in, or you really want the government out of anything except for regulating maybe the quality of the drug and taxing it?
Well, I want the government to do what the Swiss government has done. You may recall hearing about so-called needle park.
Right, Zurich, I think, had them.
In Zurich.
Right.
Now, the reason the officials of that city decided that they were going to create this public space where heroin addicts could shoot up to their heart's content was to get them off the streets, out of the downtown area, all of these pristine tourist areas, tourism having suffered a lot because of heroin addiction. So they created this park. Well, it didn't work, and about 18 months later, they realized that experiment was not the answer. And so what they did was provide heroin to users, which sounds so counterintuitive, sounds so immoral, or at least irresponsible. But in fact, this is what happened. Let's say there were 300 users of Needle Park. They were told, Needle Park is no longer an option for you. Here is an option. And under medical supervision, with the heroin actually provided by the government, these addicts were able to inject to a maintenance level. That meant they didn't have to steal, they didn't have to cheat, they didn't have to sell drugs, they didn't have to prostitute themselves. They were able, from their government, to get the very substance to which they are addicted. And one of the things that we learned from that experience, this goes back now 15 years, is that the employment rate, let's just be real, heroin addicts have a miserable employment
I'm sure
rate.
they do. I wouldn't hire one.
They have a miserable personal life, a chaotic and unhealthy life. Their only friend in the world really is that substance that they're injecting into their veins 2, 3, 4 times a day. So once that whole issue was resolved for them, some of them fell in love and got married, some of them found jobs, and a good number of them went from heroin to methadone, and at least a fraction of that original number are now drug-free, which is a pretty remarkable story. Their only predicted outcome of remaining in that earlier life is death.
Now, last question, and I wish we had more time, but we don't. You know the argument by people who favor stronger drug control, and that is if you lift all the barriers, more people are going to use this. That certainly more people use alcohol and tobacco, and right now marijuana use and other drug use is much, much lower than those legal drug levels. You remove the barriers, and you're not just going to have 300 heroin addicts. You're going to have 30,000 heroin addicts or cocaine or whatever. How do you address the argument that making it legal simply tells people it's okay to use it?
Well, first of all, we are making a grand assumption that we're going to see an increase in the number of heroin addicts, for example, if I can use just that drug and isolate on it for a second. How many of us are waiting for heroin to become legal so we can stick a needle in our arm and inject that substance?
Not many, but many are waiting for marijuana to be legal. Let's face it.
Of course. And how many of those? The short answer to that question is 100 million Americans have already tried it at least once. Anywhere from 16 to 23 million are regular users. Marijuana is very accessible and easy for our children to score. If we were to regulate that, if we were to provide through taxation, prevention programs, education programs, treatment programs, we would see a good number of today's current users, whether it's marijuana or heroin, who've wanted to kick that habit or that addiction, finding the help that they need for just exactly that to happen.
Chief Stamper, thank you so much for giving your view on the air. I got to tell you something. There are not many chiefs of police that I don't think that advocate your view, but maybe it's growing. Maybe enough have seen the horrors that you've seen that more and more police officers and police chiefs are taking your view. Thank you so much for coming here on the Inside Scoop.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, my next guest is Dan Vetz from NORML. NORML is a national organization for the regulation of marijuana laws. I think I got that acronym right. He's a criminal defense attorney in Missouri. He's on the national board of NORML, and certainly he has seen his share of clients who are hauled up before the law for drug use. Dan Vetz, welcome to the Inside Scoop.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So you just heard my discussion, or maybe you heard a little bit at the end with Chief Norm Stamper, former Chief of Police of Seattle. Tell me, in your experience, how many clients you've seen. This is in Missouri, middle of America, so to speak. How many people are being prosecuted? Let me start with nonviolent drug crimes because, I and a lot of people don't have a lot of sympathy for violent drug users or sellers.
Sure.
If you shoot somebody, it's not the drug that bothers me, it's the shooting somebody that bothers me. So let's focus, if we can, on nonviolent drug users or nonviolent drug sellers. What kind of scale of problem are we talking about?
Well, it's a massive problem. It has led the United States to become the number one imprisoner of its own citizens on the entire planet. And I think one can say in the history of the planet, no society has put more people in prison than ours has. And the single greatest contributing factor to the massive expansion in the prison industrial complex in recent decades is drug prohibition. And the single greatest part of drug prohibition is marijuana prohibition.
Could you give me a number? Can you give me a number of people in jails, a percentage or a number for nonviolent drug crimes?
Well, I don't have that at my fingertips, but it is the single greatest contributor to the vast increase in recent years. I'm sorry I don't have a number available at the moment, but I do know that it is, among other factors, the single largest contributor to the massive expansion in prison population in this country.
Now,
I'd like to address...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sir, Mark. I want to address another point, though, that you just took up with Chief Stamper.
Sure.
I don't believe there are lots of people waiting for marijuana to be legal to start using it. And here's why I say that. I believe we have empirical evidence to point to here. As you well know, of course, since the 1970s, 18 states, I think we're up to now, have decriminalized marijuana possession.
And the District of Columbia. 18 states in the District of Columbia. Go ahead.
Well, yes. Now, that's for medical.
That's true.
But at least, and I should say 15 states have decriminalized its possession. 10 of those states did so during the 1970s. In none of those states has there been any documented greater use of marijuana than in the states where harsh criminal penalties are still maintained. So I think we can say with certainty that decriminalization does not increase the use of marijuana. Now, one might argue that legalization would have a more dramatic effect.
What would you say? What's the distinction between decriminalization and legalization? Spell it out for me.
Well, legalization would mean, at a minimum, that adults who use marijuana responsibly in private would not face any penalties for doing so, civil or criminal. And it could mean that it's legalized in the sense that alcohol, and most likely would be, taxed and regulated in the same way that alcohol is taxed and regulated. Decriminalization was a concept that was actually invented by the Nixon Schaefer Commission. President Nixon appointed a commission chaired by former Republican governor of Pennsylvania, a man named Schaefer, and they came back with a recommendation that, of course, Nixon rejected out of hand. They said marijuana use by adults should be legalized. But in the meantime, since that's not politically feasible in 1972, we should go with what we call decriminalization. And what they said decriminalization meant was to at least not inflict jail on people charged with marijuana offenses, not give them a criminal conviction record, and generally not arrest them, but issue a summons instead of making a full custody arrest.
It'd be like a speeding ticket or failure to stop at a red light, something like that?
Yes, that would be an analogy, yes.
So an infraction. So tell me this. You're a criminal defense lawyer in Missouri. Tell me about some of the clients. Obviously, you're not going to give me their names, but some of the cases that you've represented. Are these just ordinary people that get wrapped up in the justice system?
Yes, they are, in fact. In fact, I am extremely fortunate because the people I represent are, by and large, just wonderful people. I mean, they are folks who, in no other sense of the word, are a criminal. But they have, as you say, chosen to use a substance which our government says is illegal, a substance which by any rational measure is far less damaging than either tobacco or alcohol. But because they've chosen to use that substance, they are treated just like people who commit violent acts, who steal, rob, rape, and murder. I mean, there is no difference in the way we treat people who have done nothing worse than possess or cultivate or sell marijuana to other adults. Those people are treated just like violent and dangerous criminals.
Would you concede there are some dangers to marijuana, and would you believe that any kind of treatment, maybe even required by the government, is fair game? Or would you say that marijuana is so much less dangerous than, say, alcohol or tobacco that basically we should leave it alone?
Well, I'm tempted to say we should leave it alone.
It's up to you. It's your view. I'm just asking.
No, I will concede that there need to be some regulations. There need to be some restrictions. I'm certainly in favor, and Norwal's in favor of age restrictions primarily. We're not in favor of allowing children to use marijuana. We are also not in favor of allowing people to drive while they're impaired by the use of marijuana. And we're not in favor, of course, of making employers allow their workers to smoke dope at work. Those are all some very false arguments that have been made by the prohibitionists. No one that I know of is advocating those things. But we do advocate that we approach marijuana in a manner similar to alcohol and tobacco, that we tax it, that we regulate it, that we restrict the age of people who use it and can buy it. And I'll tell you that one of my personal views is that it's extremely important that we allow adults to cultivate marijuana, because if they can cultivate their own supply, then there may be no need for a big corporate marijuana industry to develop. And I know many people fear that.
Dan, would your regulation include the strength of the THC in the drug? One of the things that one of my guests talked about was the fact, and I want to know if you agree with this. He said that marijuana is 5 times more concentrated in its THC levels, 5 times more, potent, I guess would be the right word, than it was 40, 50 years ago. Do you agree that that's true? And if you do agree that it's true, would you agree that the government could regulate it to say that marijuana could not have more potency, say, than it did in the 60s?
Well, I think that's a generalization, which is not true in the broad sense. Certainly there is more high-potency marijuana available now than there was in the 60s and 70s, perhaps, but there was some pretty potent marijuana back in those days. I was around then, I can tell you for a fact. We had hashish, we had Thai sticks, we had various varieties of marijuana which were far more potent than the average marijuana. Now, today, there are certainly some concentrates, not so much the organic natural plant, but the concentrates which people are figuring out ways to make. And it's really just, again, it's just like hashish. It's just taking the parts that contain THC and concentrating them into something that you can smoke. Now, I don't think there's any reason to fear that. Just as we allow grain alcohol to be sold in liquor stores, we should allow the higher concentrates. What's important is that people know what they're getting so that they can use it in a reasonable, responsible way. But there's no reason we should restrict the potency of marijuana any more than we restrict the potency of alcohol. We can count on people, for the most part, to use those substances responsibly. You know, hardly anybody buys grain alcohol, and when they do buy it, they don't drink it straight. and most people are not looking to just, become unconscious from marijuana use either. Most people want to have a pleasant experience that allows them to enjoy other activities, and they're not looking just to get as stoned as they possibly can.
Okay, but there are some people who are. Just like most people do use alcohol responsibly, there are alcoholics that commit violence, that go on drunken binges, that drink and drive and kill people. There are people who use marijuana responsibly. There are also stoners or potheads, whatever you want to call them, who smoke constantly day in, day out into a stupor. Should there ever be a role for government in policing that, or is the answer you have a right to be stupid, and if you decide to spend your entire life smoking weed, That's your right as a free citizen.
Well, there certainly is a role for government in restricting people from driving if they are impaired by the use of marijuana and unsafe to drive. Absolutely, there's a role for government. There's also a role for government in ensuring that people know what they're getting. And that's the great danger today we have with the black market, with prohibition. People don't know what they're getting. They don't know how potent their marijuana is when they buy it. There's no way to know how potent it is. That's the most important, I think, fundamental role for government, is to help people to have the knowledge they need in order to make rational and reasonable decisions. Now, you're right. Some people go nuts drinking alcohol. Mostly it's young people who have no experience drinking alcohol. Some young people think vomiting is part of the drinking experience, but it's not for most of us. And most young people learn pretty quickly that those hangovers are not worth the fun of drinking so much liquor that you throw up and pass out. The same thing is true with marijuana. Actually, it's not as dangerous as alcohol in any sense. But some people may overindulge, they will experiment, and they will learn that the use of marijuana in moderation is far more pleasant than just trying to see how stoned you can get.
So you think that peer pressure, things like that, just experience, I mean, tobacco use is down, and it's down not so much by law, some by law about smoking in public places, but really there's a very strong social pressure against smoking. I know because I help enforce that myself. I don't like people smoking around me. They can smoke in their own homes for all I care, but I don't want them making me smell and making me cough. So do you think, but on the other hand, while there is social pressure against tobacco, I think there's less social pressure against marijuana. Do you agree with me on that? And do you think that can change?
There are different types of social pressure, but tobacco is an excellent example of what we're talking about. You're right. The use of tobacco is down dramatically in recent decades, and we did not have to throw anybody in jail to make that happen. We don't have to throw people in jail to educate them to act in their own self-interest. That's why tobacco use is down. Not as much because of the social disapproval, although you're right, there is that. But most of that social disapproval is because people are saying you are a fool to smoke tobacco. You are going to get lung cancer, emphysema. You're going to suffer a wide range of bad health effects from using that tobacco. That's why most people stop using it who have stopped. They're not threatened with jail. They simply are educated to understand the true harms and health risks they take. Now, I would concede that marijuana is not harmless, but the potential harm from marijuana use is far, far less, and the potential for addiction is far, far less than it is with alcohol or tobacco.
And you would support then some efforts by the government or to encourage people not to smoke marijuana. You'd be fine with that. You just don't want the dramatic penalties.
As long as the government is telling our people the truth, yes, I have no problem with that at all. Yes, if they will give a balanced and fair and honest appraisal of the true health hazards of marijuana use, we have no problem with that. Inhaling smoke is probably generally not a healthy thing to do. But you know, there is increasing evidence that even when it's inhaled, that cannabis actually does have some positive health impact.
And
there
in fact,
no evidence.
Yeah.
There's no evidence that tobacco helps anybody. There's no evidence that tobacco helps anyone's health.
We actually, Chris from Safe Americans for Safe Access, and I talked about the medical benefits, Chris Hermes. So we've had that discussion. Dan, thank you very much for coming here on the Inside Scoop and sharing your wisdom. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark, very much.
Okay, we have one last guest, and that is, last but not least, it's Spike Bradford. He is a senior research associate for the Justice Policy Institute. Do we have Spike Bradford on the air? Are you there, Spike? Oh, well, we're getting him now. Tell you what, why don't we take a break? Or do we have him right now? Okay. Spike Bradford, you're on. All right. Spike Bradford is a senior research associate for the Justice Policy Institute, and he has also done a lot of study, particularly on the criminal justice system, on drug policy, on public health, and talking about the ways in which the criminal justice system affects people's lives. We've talked about the dangers of the drug and the dangers of the criminal justice system. Spike, welcome to the Inside Scoop.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So now you have studied, I guess, give me an example of some of the things you've studied. The actual impact of the criminal justice system on these people's lives. You got some numbers for me?
Well, I mean, I don't have a lot of numbers with me, but I will say Justice Policy Institute, our sort of baseline consideration when we're looking at issues like this is does the criminal justice system need to be involved? So when we're talking about drug use, as you are today, and particularly marijuana use, the question has to be, the criminal justice system isn't a nice system to be involved in your life. I mean, that's the way it's designed. So if you've got someone who's having trouble in their lives or they're just a recreational drug user, does the criminal justice system really have a necessary role? And in most instances, we think that answer is no.
And tell me why not. I mean, there are some harms to these drugs. Why? Sure. Tell me the harms of the criminal justice system. Sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease. I mean, I'm sure if you've got a headache, that if you shoot yourself in the foot, you won't be concentrating on your head very much. But that's not a good solution. Tell me exactly the harms of the criminal justice system in treating drug crimes.
Sure. Well, I listened to just the end of your interview with Sabet. Is it Kevin Sabet?
Kevin Sabet. Now, he's the quarterback of the anti-drug movement. He worked for Office of National Drug Control Policy under Clinton, Bush, and Obama. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. And I'm glad that you had him on here. But he really minimizes the impact that being pulled into the criminal justice system can have on somebody. He talks about, you get pulled over for something else and you've got, some marijuana on you. You might get 1 to 2 days in jail and then a $300 fine.
Right.
Well, for the bulk of people who are being arrested for marijuana possession, the bulk of them are poor people of color. Now, 1 to 2 days in jail and a $300 fine, for me, I could probably, deal with that in my life. For someone who is working minimum wage or maybe not working full time, that could be a catastrophic life event where you could lose your job, you can lose your housing if you live in a subsidized housing. $300, for some people that could be, a third, a quarter of your monthly income. So,
and we also talked about the fact that if you're arrested, you could not be hired for a job. You could lose your job. You could not be hired, particularly if you spend a day or two in jail. So my question for you is, and it's the same question I've asked pretty much all my other guests, what do you see as the solution here? Some have argued for legalization. Some have argued for decriminalization. One of my guests was okay with lockup treatment centers. What do you think that this should be regulated at all? And if so, how?
Well, again, like Chief Stamper, I mean, I have to sort of divorce my personal views from the Justice Policy Institute.
Fair enough.
Justice Policy Institute really advocates for just minimizing the use of the criminal justice system. So using a drug should not necessarily be a criminal offense. That's a public health issue. And we don't need to, and we know that it doesn't work to criminalize that behavior. If somebody has a problem, we need to deal with it in a health system response and not a criminal justice system response. A lot of I don't have a model of regulation or distribution or whatever, but a lot of what your guests have been saying, makes a lot of sense, especially Chief Stamper. I think alcohol is a great model. Look at alcohol right now. I can go to the store, I can get what I want, I can come home, I can be responsible with it. If I commit a crime, another crime, if I hurt somebody, if I'm driving while I'm intoxicated, that's the offense. The alcohol isn't the offense. The marijuana shouldn't be the offense. If I have an alcohol problem, I'm not going to get locked up to be...
You might if you're publicly intoxicated. That may be only then.
I don't know. A treatment.
Hang on for me. Sorry, Spike. Your cell phone is sort of going in and out. If you could get to some place where you have a strong signal, we want to hear every word you have to say. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Okay. I'm not sure how often alcohol, lock-up alcohol treatment is given. And, the point is really that drug use doesn't need to be a criminal justice response, have a criminal justice response. We should reserve that for when it's really necessary. If someone has a drug problem, treatment is what we need to be doing.
And how do you get someone into treatment if they don't want treatment? I mean, I talked with Chief Stamper about even more serious drugs, cocaine, heroin, LSD. A lot of particularly marijuana users, but certainly the severe drug users say, you know what, leave me alone. I'm happy with my drug. I don't want treatment. Would you then involve some kind of force, criminal justice, or do you say, you know what, they're not being smart, but they're free to be stupid? What do you say?
Sure. I mean, I would not advocate a criminal justice forcing treatment response. And I think the Swiss model of making all that stuff available and making people realize that there aren't good life choices, and by refocusing the amount of energy and money and time that we spend on law enforcement now and refocusing that into positive life interventions and just having the resources that a family member can come and say, hey, I have somebody who needs help. How can I convince them to get that help, rather than a badge and a gun? Doesn't really work. So yeah, I don't want to live in a society where, if my cousin wants to sit in his basement and smoke pot all day, I'm going to lock him up. I just don't think that's the world that we want to live in, and it's inefficient and it's harmful to people that maybe need help. And the other thing I wanted to mention, there's the medical marijuana issue.
Okay, real quick, because I'm afraid we're running out of time. I apologize, but go ahead, make your point real quickly.
We need to be careful from a criminal justice standpoint that we're not over-medicalizing marijuana and just turning it into another system of enforcement. The bulk of marijuana users are recreational users, and the bulk of people that get arrested for marijuana are recreational users. If we just turn marijuana into another OxyContin, we're not solving the criminal justice problem.
I got you. I'm sorry to cut you off. We had a long show, and unfortunately, you were at the end of it. But I really appreciate your wisdom on this. Thank you so much for coming here on The Inside Scoop. This is Mark Levine. I hope you've enjoyed the show today. Lots of interesting responses. If you have a comment on what you heard today, go to my website, marklevinetalk.com. Leave it there. You can also follow me on Facebook. Go to the Mark Levine fan page. Leave a comment there. Follow me on Twitter at Mark Levine Talk. Let me know what you thought about today's show. Whether you agree or disagree, I always want to hear from you. And of course, we'll be back next week, next Sunday, AM 1480, We Act Radio for the Raucous Caucus at noon and the Inside Scoop at 1. This is Mark Levine signing off.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Now get out there and do something.